My mother-in-law told everyone, at our anniversary dinner, that I had trapped her son into marriage in front of 60 guests. She did not know I had been recording the entire toast on my phone for our wedding memory book. Tonight, every single story is about a mother-in-law who pushed too far and 5 daughters-in-law who finally pushed back in ways that changed everything. 5 confrontations, 5 satisfying endings. Every single one has an update. This is the part that gets me every time. Let me take you back to where each of these stories started. Story 1 begins. My name is Michelle. I am 36 years old. I live in Raleigh, North Carolina, and 14 months ago my mother-in-law stood up during a toast at our 10th wedding anniversary dinner. A dinner I had spent 4 months planning, with 60 guests including both of our extended families and several close friends we had known for over a decade, and said in front of the entire room that she had always known I had trapped her son into marriage, and that she hoped, after 10 years, I had finally proven her wrong. My mother-in-law's name is Diane. She is 67 years old, and she had maintained a specific coolness toward me across the entirety of my marriage to her son that I had managed, for 10 years, with what I now understand was more patience than the situation deserved. I want to explain the trapped comment because it requires context. When my husband James and I had gotten engaged 11 years ago, I had been 3 months pregnant with our first child. A pregnancy that had not been planned but that we had both been genuinely happy about, that had accelerated a proposal James had already been planning, and that Diane had, from the moment she learned of it, characterized privately and then, at my anniversary dinner, publicly as evidence that I had engineered a pregnancy to secure a marriage. I had not recorded the toast because I anticipated anything. I had recorded it, along with several other toasts that evening, because I had hired a videographer specifically to capture the anniversary dinner for a memory book I was making, and the videographer had captured Diane's entire toast in high-definition audio and video from a professional camera positioned at the front of the room. Diane did not know this. She had assumed, I believe, that a comment delivered at a family dinner would exist only in the memory of those present and would fade, as such comments often do, into the specific unreliable territory of he said she said. It did not fade. It existed in 4 minutes and 12 seconds of professional video with clear audio, in which Diane described, at length and with specific details she had apparently been rehearsing privately for 11 years, her belief that I had planned my pregnancy strategically and had, in her words, trapped James into a life he would not otherwise have chosen. I want to tell you what happened in the room while this was occurring because the room's reaction was its own significant part of the story. Several guests looked at their plates. My mother, who was present, stood up before Diane had finished and said, clearly and audibly, that she did not think this was the appropriate venue for this conversation, and that perhaps Diane would like to sit down. Diane did not sit down immediately. She continued for another minute before James stood up and said, directly to his mother, that what she was saying was not true and was not appropriate, and that she needed to stop. Diane sat down. The dinner continued in a subdued way that 14 months later, I still remember with specific clarity. I did not confront Diane that night. I did what I have learned, across several situations in my adult life, produces better outcomes than immediate confrontation, which is that I waited and gathered myself and thought carefully about what I wanted to do with what had happened. What I decided to do, 3 weeks later, was request a meeting with Diane through James, at which I brought a laptop and showed her the video. I want to describe her reaction because it is relevant. She went very pale. She asked where I had gotten it. I told her the videographer I had hired for our anniversary had captured it as part of the event coverage I had paid for. I told her I was not showing it to her to threaten her, but because I needed her to understand that what she had said had been recorded clearly, in a way that removed any ambiguity about what had actually been said, and that I needed her to understand the specific factual reality of our situation as I understood it. James and I had been together for 11 months before I became pregnant. The pregnancy had not been planned by either of us, but had also not been the product of any strategy on my part, and James had told me, on the video I showed Diane, in his own toast earlier that same evening, that the day he found out I was pregnant was one of the happiest of his life, and that he had already been planning to propose. I asked Diane to explain, given this timeline and given James's own words on the same evening's recording, what specifically she believed I had engineered and how. She did not have an answer. I told Diane that I was not asking for an apology in that meeting, though I would welcome one, but that I needed her to understand that any future repetition of the trapped narrative, in any setting, would result in the video being shared with the family members who had heard the original toast, so that they could compare what she had said with what had actually happened. Diane has not repeated the narrative since. Our relationship remains distant. 14 months has not been enough time to build warmth where there was none for 10 years, but it is distant in a quieter way than it was before. Update: 4 months later. Diane sent me a card last month. Not a phone call, not an in-person conversation. A card handwritten that said she had been thinking about the anniversary dinner and about what I had shown her, and that she wanted me to know she understood now that she had been wrong about the timeline and wrong to have said what she said in front of everyone. The card did not use the word sorry directly, but it came close enough that I received it as the apology it was reaching toward. I showed it to James. He read it twice and said it was more than he had expected his mother to offer, given 11 years of the narrative she had been maintaining privately before it became public at our dinner. I have not responded to the card yet. I am thinking about what response, if any, is the right one, and I think the thinking is more honest than a quick and generous response would be. James's daughter, our daughter now 10 years old, asked me last week why Grandma Diane does not come to as many things as Grandma Susan, my mother. I gave her an age-appropriate honest answer that did not include specifics, and that focused on the fact that relationships take different amounts of time to build, and that ours with Diane was still building. My daughter accepted this the way 10-year-olds accept most careful adult explanations, with a nod and a follow-up question about something else entirely. Diane's toast was captured, on professional video, by accident. But in story 2, what was captured completely on purpose, because the daughter-in-law, in this next story, had learned 3 years earlier that her mother-in-law operated in a specific way, and she had prepared accordingly for 3 years, waiting for exactly the right moment. Wait, this is the part that gets me, because when the moment finally came, it lasted less than 2 minutes, and it changed everything. Here is what happened. My name is Amanda. I am 39 years old, I live in Denver, Colorado, and 12 months ago I brought a folder of our actual joint financial statements to a Christmas dinner attended by my husband's entire extended family, and used it to correct, clearly and with documentation, a narrative that my mother-in-law had been constructing about our marriage for the preceding 3 years. My mother-in-law's name is Carol. She is 62 years old, and she had been telling my husband's siblings, his aunts and uncles, and his grandmother, a woman I am close to and whose opinion of me matters to me significantly, that I was, in her words, financially draining her son, that I did not work enough, that I spent carelessly, that my husband Mark was, as a result of my financial habits, working himself into the ground to support a lifestyle I insisted on. None of this was true. I have worked full-time throughout our 9-year marriage in a role that pays well. Mark and I maintain a joint budget that we review together monthly. We have a savings rate that our own financial advisor has described as unusually disciplined for a couple our age. I had not known for most of the 3 years Carol had been constructing this narrative that it existed. I found out through Mark's sister, who mentioned, during a phone call I happened to overhear part of, something about how she hoped things were getting better financially for Mark and me. When I asked her directly what she meant, she told me, somewhat uncomfortably, what Carol had been saying at family gatherings I did not attend, and in conversations I was not present for. I want to tell you about the 3 weeks between learning this and Christmas dinner, because those 3 weeks involved careful preparation rather than immediate reaction, that I gathered our actual financial documents, bank statements, our budget spreadsheet, our savings account growth over the preceding 3 years, and a letter from our financial advisor, whom I called and asked directly whether he would be willing to write a brief factual summary of our financial position if I needed it for a family matter. He agreed. I did not tell Mark what I was planning. I told him only that I had learned about his mother's comments, and that I intended to address them at Christmas dinner in a way that would not require him to defend me verbally. which I knew he found difficult in the specific dynamic he had with his mother. Christmas dinner had 18 people present, including Mark's grandmother, who is 83 and who I specifically wanted present for what I was going to say, because her opinion of our marriage mattered to me, and because I believed she deserved accurate information rather than the narrative Carol had been providing her for 3 years. After the meal, during the specific lull before dessert when conversation typically turns to updates about everyone's lives, I said I wanted to share something with the family. I brought out the folder. I said I had recently learned that there had been some concern, over the past few years, about our financial situation, and that I wanted to make sure everyone had accurate information rather than assumptions. I distributed copies of a simple one-page summary I had prepared. Our combined income, our savings rate, our investment growth, and the financial advisor's brief letter confirming our financial position was, in his professional assessment, notably strong for our age and income level. I did not mention Carol by name. I did not need to. 18 people, including Carol, sat with a one-page document that directly contradicted a narrative that had apparently been circulating for 3 years. And the room's silence told me that most of them had heard some version of what Carol had been saying, and were now looking at documentation that showed it was false. Mark's grandmother read the page carefully twice, and then looked up and said she was glad to know things were going so well, and that she had heard some concerning things, but was relieved they were not true. She did not look at Carol when she said this, but everyone in the room understood who she meant. Carol did not say anything for the rest of the dinner. Mark told me afterward that his mother had called him 3 days later and asked why I had felt the need to embarrass her in front of the family. I told Mark, when he relayed this to me, that I had not embarrassed her. I had corrected a factual inaccuracy that she had constructed and maintained for 3 years, and that the embarrassment, if she felt any, was a natural consequence of documentation contradicting fiction, rather than anything I had done beyond presenting accurate information. Update: 3 months later. Carol has not repeated the financial narrative to any family member, as far as I am aware, in the 3 months since Christmas. Mark's sister told me last month that Carol had mentioned, in a conversation about something unrelated, that she had been wrong about our finances, and that she should not have said what she said. This was relayed to me secondhand rather than said to me directly, which I have come to understand is simply how Carol processes being wrong. She does not apologize directly, but she does eventually correct her position with other people, which produces a kind of gradual repair that is not entirely satisfying, but that I have decided to accept as the version of accountability that is available from her. Mark's grandmother sent me a card last month, unrelated to any of this, just a general thinking of you card, and included a note that said she always knew I was a good match for Mark and was glad to have that confirmed. I keep that card in my desk drawer. I look at it sometimes when I need reminding that the people whose opinions actually matter to me have accurate information now, and that the documentation did what documentation is supposed to do. Amanda brought financial statements to Christmas dinner. But in story 3, what was brought was not a folder. It was a phone. And what was on that phone was something the mother-in-law had sent herself, by mistake, 3 days earlier, to the exact wrong number. Can you imagine sending your daughter-in-law the evidence of your own scheme completely by accident? This is the part that stays with me the longest tonight. Here is what happened. My name is Jessica. I am 34 years old. I live in Austin, Texas. And 10 months ago my mother-in-law sent me a text message that had been intended for her sister, in which she described, in specific and organized detail, a plan she had been developing over several months to convince my husband that our marriage was not working and that he should consider leaving me. My mother-in-law's name is Patricia. She is 60 years old and my husband David's mother, and she and I had always had what I would describe as a workable, but not warm relationship across the 6 years of my marriage to David. The text arrived on a Wednesday afternoon while I was at work. I opened it expecting something ordinary. Patricia texted David and me fairly regularly about family logistics, and found instead a message that began by referencing something her sister had apparently said in a previous conversation, and then continued into specific strategic detail. I am not going to reproduce the exact language of the text here, but I will describe its substance accurately. Patricia had written about specific comments she planned to make to David over the coming months designed to plant doubts about our marriage. She referenced conversations she had already had with him in which she had, according to her own description, subtly suggested that I seemed unhappy, that our marriage seemed strained, and that he deserved someone who appreciated him more. She wrote about timing these comments around specific upcoming events: a family reunion, David's birthday, when he would be most receptive to reflection about his life choices. She wrote near the end of the message that she believed if she was patient and consistent, David would come to the conclusion himself within a year, which she noted was preferable to any approach that seemed like direct interference. I read the message twice while sitting at my desk at work. I want to describe what I did next because the sequence was deliberate rather than reactive. I did not respond to Patricia. I did not call David immediately. I took screenshots of the entire message, every word, and saved them to 3 separate locations: my phone's cloud backup, an email I sent to myself, and a printed copy I made at a print shop near my office during my lunch break, because I had learned, from a friend's similar experience years earlier, that screenshots alone could be disputed as fabricated, but that a documented paper trail with timestamps was harder to challenge. I did not respond to Patricia's message at all that day, which I understood would likely prompt her to realize her error and potentially attempt to delete or explain it away, but I decided that having thorough documentation was more important than an immediate response. That evening I showed David the screenshots. I want to tell you about his reaction because it matters to the story. He read the messages slowly twice, and then he was quiet for a long time. Then he said he needed to think. I told him I understood, and that I was not asking him to respond immediately, only to know what I now knew. Over the following week, David and I had several long conversations. He told me that several of the comments Patricia had referenced in the text, vague suggestions that I seemed unhappy, comments about him deserving more appreciation, had in fact occurred, and that he had not thought much of them at the time because they had seemed like ordinary maternal observations rather than part of a deliberate campaign. Understanding that they were part of a deliberate, planned campaign changed how he understood them entirely. David called Patricia at the end of that week. I was not present for the call, at his request, because he wanted to have the conversation with his mother directly rather than as a confrontation staged with me present. He told me afterward that the call had been one of the most difficult conversations of his adult life. He had read her own words back to her. She had, according to David, first tried to explain the message as taken out of context, then acknowledged it was real but claimed she had been venting rather than planning, and eventually, after David pressed her with specific questions about the timing details she had referenced, acknowledged that she had been actively working toward the outcome the message described. Patricia and David's relationship has been significantly altered in the 10 months since. He speaks to her, but with a specific new distance that I believe is appropriate given what she attempted. I have not spoken to Patricia directly since the text, at my own choice, which David has respected. Update. 4 months later, David told me last month that Patricia had asked him, during a recent call, whether there was anything she could do to repair things with me. David told her that he did not know, because it was not his relationship to repair on my behalf, but that he thought a genuine and specific acknowledgement directed at me rather than at him might be a starting point. I have not received any such acknowledgement as of this writing. I am not waiting for one in any active sense. David and I are in a stronger place than we were before the text, in the specific way that surviving an attempted manipulation together, and recognizing it clearly together, sometimes produces. He has told me, more than once in the months since, that reading his mother's actual planned strategy in her own words was different from any vague sense he might have had that she was not fully supportive of our marriage, and that the specificity of the plan was what had made the difference for him. I think about the accidental nature of how I found out sometimes. I think about how close that plan came to succeeding without me ever knowing it existed, if Patricia had simply sent the text to the correct recipient. I am grateful for the mistake in a way that still surprises me when I examine it directly. Patricia's plan was exposed by one wrong number. But in story 4, nothing was accidental. The daughter-in-law in this story had known exactly what her mother-in-law was doing for 2 years, and she had been building something the entire time, quietly, patiently, until the day she had everything she needed to end it completely. In one conversation. Let that sink in. Here is what she built and how she used it. My name is Rebecca. I am 41 years old. I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And 8 months ago I sat down with my mother-in-law and presented her with 2 years of documented instances in which she had undermined my parenting decisions directly to my children, contradicted rules I had established in front of them, and told them things about their upbringing designed to position herself as more permissive and more loving than me. My mother-in-law's name is Susan. She is 65 years old and she watches my 2 children, ages 8 and 11. 2 afternoons a week while I work, an arrangement that had been in place for 2 years and that I had, until 8 months ago, believed was functioning reasonably well despite some friction that I had attributed to ordinary generational differences in parenting style. What I came to understand, over 2 years of gradually accumulating evidence, was that the friction was not ordinary difference. It was deliberate undermining. My children, particularly my 11-year-old daughter, had begun over the preceding year to make comments that revealed a pattern. Statements like "Grandma says you're too strict," or "Grandma says I should be allowed to have my phone at dinner because that's a silly rule," or most significantly, a comment my daughter made about 6 months before I confronted Susan in which she said "Grandma says you don't really understand kids because you had me too young." I want to explain how I built the case, because building it carefully was the entire reason the confrontation worked as effectively as it did. I started keeping a private log, dated, specific, with direct quotes from my children whenever they repeated something Susan had said. Approximately 18 months before the confrontation, after the accumulation of comments had reached a point where I recognized a pattern rather than isolated incidents. I did not confront Susan as each incident occurred because I had learned from an earlier and less successful attempt to address a single comment that Susan was skilled at reframing individual incidents as misunderstandings, or as my children misremembering what she had actually said. I needed the pattern to be undeniable, which meant I needed volume and specificity and consistency across time. Over 18 months I documented 43 separate instances. Some were minor. Several were significant, including at least 6 occasions on which Susan had directly told my children that a specific rule I had established was unnecessary, or that I was wrong to have established it. The confrontation happened on a Saturday morning, when Susan came to pick up my son for what was supposed to be a regular outing. I asked her to come inside instead. I had my documentation printed and organized by date. I told her I needed to discuss a pattern I had identified over the preceding 18 months, and I walked her through it chronologically, reading direct quotes my children had repeated to me, with dates, without editorializing or accusing her of malicious intent, simply presenting the pattern as data. I want to describe Susan's reaction because it evolved over the course of the conversation in a way that I think is instructive. She began defensive, characterizing several of the individual instances as misunderstandings. As I continued through the documented pattern, 43 instances is difficult to characterize as 43 separate misunderstandings. Her defensiveness gave way to something quieter. Near the end of the documentation, she said very quietly that she had not realized how much she had been doing this or how consistently, and that hearing it laid out chronologically was different from experiencing each individual instance as it happened. I told Susan that I was not seeking to end her relationship with my children, which mattered to them and which I valued, but that the undermining needed to stop completely and immediately, and that I would be implementing a new arrangement in which our childcare time would include check-ins that would allow me to identify quickly if the pattern resumed. Susan agreed to this without argument, which surprised me given how the conversation had begun. Update: 4 months later. The pattern has not resumed in the 4 months since our conversation, as far as I have been able to determine through continued attention to my children's comments and through the check-in system I implemented. My daughter mentioned, about 2 months after the confrontation, that Grandma had told her that Mom makes good rules, and that Grandma should have supported them better. I did not know how to receive this comment initially. It felt almost too complete a resolution. But my daughter said it with a specific unprompted quality of a child reporting something rather than performing something, which led me to believe it was genuine. Susan and I have not discussed the confrontation again directly, but our interactions since have been noticeably different. More careful on her part, more collaborative in a way that suggests she understood the stakes of what I presented to her. I continue the documentation practice in a lighter form, simply as a habit I developed that I have found useful beyond this specific situation, and I have not needed to use it again. Rebecca documented 43 instances over 18 months. Our final story tonight, Story 5, is about a mother-in-law who did not undermine. Quietly over time, she did something much bigger, all at once, and what the daughter-in-law did in response did not just end one conflict. It changed how an entire family operated going forward. This is the last story, and it might be the most satisfying one you hear tonight. Here is what happened. My name is Laura. I am 43 years old. I live in Kansas City, Missouri, and 16 months ago my mother-in-law sent me a text message informing me that my 2 children would not be welcome at the annual family reunion she hosts every summer. A reunion that draws approximately 50 members of my husband's extended family, and that my children had attended every year of their lives, because she disapproved of what she characterized as my permissive parenting style, and did not want my children's behavior to affect the other grandchildren present. My mother-in-law's name is Barbara. She is 68 years old and hosts the reunion at her large property every July, a tradition that has existed for over 30 years and that represents, for my husband's extended family, one of the primary occasions each year when everyone gathers in one place. My children are 9 and 6. I want to be clear about what Barbara characterized as permissive parenting, because the framing matters. My parenting approach, which I developed deliberately, and which I have discussed extensively with a family therapist over several years, emphasizes natural consequences, collaborative problem-solving, and limited use of punitive discipline. It is a documented, intentional approach that has produced, according to my children's teachers and their pediatrician, 2 well-adjusted and socially capable children. Barbara's approach to parenting, 30 years earlier with her own children, had been considerably more traditional and punitive, and she had, across the years of my marriage to her son, made her disapproval of my methods known in various ways that I had generally managed with patience. The reunion exclusion was different in scale and consequence from anything she had done previously. I want to describe my response because I am proud of it in a way that required significant deliberation to arrive at. I did not argue with Barbara about the exclusion. I did not attempt to convince her to reverse the decision. Instead, I called my husband's aunt, Barbara's younger sister, a woman named Diane who owns a property with significant outdoor space, and who has always been warm toward my children, and asked whether she would be willing to host a smaller gathering the same weekend, for anyone in the family who wanted an alternative to Barbara's reunion. Diane agreed immediately, and told me she had been uncomfortable with Barbara's decision when she heard about it secondhand, and welcomed the opportunity to do something about it. I then sent a message to the family group chat, the same one Barbara used to coordinate reunion logistics, explaining, briefly and without extensive editorializing, that my children had been excluded from Barbara's reunion this year, and that Diane had generously offered to host a smaller family gathering the same weekend for anyone who would like an alternative, with my family attending. I want to describe what happened next because it surprised me in its scale. Over the following 2 weeks, as people responded in the group chat and through individual messages, it became clear that Barbara's decision had not been well received by a significant portion of the extended family. Several cousins responded that they had always found Barbara's traditional views on parenting somewhat difficult, and that they would rather spend the weekend somewhere their own children's more contemporary upbringing was not subject to judgment. By the time the July weekend arrived, Diane's gathering included 23 attendees, more than a third of the family who typically attended Barbara's reunion. Barbara's reunion, according to my husband, who did attend briefly out of obligation to his mother before joining us at Diane's later that same day, was noticeably smaller than usual and markedly more subdued. I did not orchestrate the 23 attendees deliberately as an act of revenge. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters to understanding what happened. I simply responded to an exclusion by creating an alternative, and the alternative revealed, through the choices 23 people made independently, something about how the extended family actually felt about Barbara's approach that had perhaps not been fully visible before because there had never previously been an alternative to choose. Barbara called me 2 days after the reunion weekend. The call was difficult. She said I had humiliated her by splitting the family. I told her, as calmly as I was able, that I had not split the family. She had excluded my children from an event the rest of the family had always attended together, and I had simply provided an option for the family members who did not wish to attend an event my children could not attend. I told her that the attendance at Diane's gathering had not been my doing, but had been the independent choice of 23 adults who had decided, for their own reasons, where they wanted to spend their weekend. Update: 4 months later. Barbara has not hosted the annual reunion this year at all. She informed the family group chat 2 months ago that she was taking a break from organizing it, which several family members privately told me they interpreted as a response to the reduced attendance the previous summer. Diane has offered to host again this coming July, and the informal consensus in the family group chat suggests that most people plan to attend Diane's gathering rather than wait to see if Barbara resumes hers. My children have not been explicitly re-invited to anything Barbara is hosting, though Barbara has, notably, begun attending smaller family gatherings, including a birthday party for my daughter 2 months ago, where she was polite and even warm toward my children in a way I had not seen from her previously. My husband believes his mother is recalibrating in response to the consequences of her decision, though he is careful to note that he does not believe she has fully acknowledged to herself that the exclusion was wrong, only that it produced outcomes she had not anticipated and did not want repeated. I am content with this partial recalibration for now. My children attended Diane's gathering last month for a smaller summer barbecue and had, according to their own enthusiastic report, one of the best days of their summer. I think about the family group chat message I sent 16 months ago sometimes, and about how a simple factual statement, offered without extensive argument, produced a response I could not have orchestrated, and would not have known how to orchestrate even if I had wanted to. Sometimes the most effective response to an unfair exclusion is not confrontation. It is simply building something good somewhere else and letting people choose.